Today's lesson will open up Chapter 9 on Food and Agriculture, beginning with Key Issues 1 and 2. The following key issues will be discussed from Chapter 9. Where did agriculture originate? Why do people consume different foods? Where is agriculture distributed? And why do farmers face sustainability challenges? Beginning with Key Issue 1, we're going to start by talking about two simple topics. Where did agriculture originate? First, we'll introduce food and agriculture, and then we'll talk about subsistence and commercial agriculture and the difference between them. There are two agricultural revolutions you should be familiar with and know the difference between. The first agricultural revolution happened at the end of the Ice Age. This revolution happened for two separate factors, environmental and cultural. For environmental factors, the first domestication of crops and animals coincided with climate change. This marks the end of the last ice age when permanent ice cover receded from Earth's mid-latitudes to the polar regions. What resulted was massive redistribution of humans, other animals, and plants. Agricultural hearths began to develop because people wanted to live in one place versus being nomads and moving around. As hunters and gatherers started to stay in place, they probably observed over time that damaged or discarded food produced new plants. Over thousands of years, plant cultivation evolved from a combination of accident and actual experiment. The second agricultural revolution happened as the result of mechanization. Drills, plows, techniques with rotation and transportation by train. So with these new innovations, farming became much more efficient. And of course, this is happening much more rapidly with the industrialization of agriculture as well. Take a look at figure 9-2, located on page 309 of your textbook. This map will show all of the agricultural hearths, meaning the regions in which agriculture first developed. Regions include Southwest Asia, where the earliest crops domesticated and around 10,000 years ago were thought to have produced barley, wheat, lentil, and olive. It's also thought to be the hearth for the domestication of the largest number of animals, including cattle, goats, pigs, and sheep. East Asia is another region. Rice is thought to have been domesticated in East Asia more than 10,000 years ago. Chickens are thought to have diffused from South Asia around 4,000 years ago, while the horse is considered to have been domesticated in Central Asia. Sorghum, which is a cereal grain, was domesticated in Central Africa around 8,000 years ago. Yams may also have been domesticated even earlier, with millet and rice being domesticated in sub-Saharan Africa independently, meaning separately from the influence of East Asia. Looking at Latin America, two important hearths of crop domestication are thought to have emerged in Mexico and Peru around 4,000 to 5,000 years ago. Mexico is said to be the hearth for beans and cotton, and Peru for potatoes. The most important contribution of the Americas to crop domestication is maize, also known as corn, and this may have emerged in the two hearths independently around the same time. It's very important to know the difference between subsistence and commercial agriculture. Subsistence farming is more common in less developed countries or developing countries, and commercial agriculture is more common in your developed countries. Taking a look at percentage of farmers, that's going to give you an indication of whether or not you're looking at a more developed country or a developing country. These numbers are high in subsistence and low in commercial. This relates back to what you learned about in Unit 1, looking at agricultural density. Remember, the more farmers to the land, the less developed. The less farmers to the land, the more developed. And the reasons for this is because of innovation, machinery, science, technology. That's going to be very low in your subsistence agriculture and very high in your commercial agriculture. For example, subsistence farmers might do a lot of their farming with hand tools and animal power. With commercial farming, farmers have access to sophisticated machinery, and they also have access to fertilizers, herbicides, hybrid plants, animal breeds, and feeding practices. So this can help them generate higher crop yields, as well as healthier animals. In addition, we can also look at farm size. Commercial farming generally utilizes much larger land than subsistence. For subsistence farming, remember, we're talking about families cultivating food for themselves, mainly for survival. So their land is going to be much smaller and confined, whereas for commercial farming, they're trying to generate as much product from the land as possible. Take a quick look at figure 9-3 located on page 310 of your textbook. This is going to indicate the percent of the labor force engaged in agriculture. Developing countries have a higher percentage of the labor force engaged in agriculture, primarily subsistence. As you can see, there are far more farmers in Asia and sub-Saharan Africa. Take a look at figure 9-4 located on page 311 of your textbook. This key is going to indicate farmland per tractor. Small amounts of farmland per tractor indicate a strong role of machinery in agriculture. That means the darker the green, the more tractors the farmland, which means the more developed the regions. You can see North America, Europe, New Zealand being very dark green. Next, we'll get into key issue 2. Why do people consume different foods? First, we'll look at diet and nutrition, and then source of nutrients. First, let's talk about something very important, food security. The United Nations defines food security as physical, social, and economic access at all times to safe and nutritious food, sufficient to meet dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. Through this definition, it is said that about 10% of the world's population does not have food security. In developed countries, people eat more from different sources than people in developing countries. For most of you, you're highly disconnected from where food comes from and the farms they're cultivated on. You go to a grocery store and most of the products are packaged or they are sliced up and ready to cook. In developed countries, there's a high caloric intake, and a lot of the food that is consumed will be from different varieties, including a much higher percentage of intake from protein. There are 3 primary things to consider when looking at diet and nutrition. First, looking at level of development. As I just mentioned, people in developed countries eat more from different sources than people in developing countries. The next is physical conditions. Climate is important in influencing what can be most easily grown and consumed in developing countries. In developed countries, however, food is shipped long distances to locations with different climates, so that access is much more abundant. Lastly, in looking at cultural preferences, some food preferences and avoidances are expressed without regard for physical and economic factors. So, for example, there might be customs or traditions or restrictions even that may dictate the food that's consumed or not consumed. Some cultural restrictions might include alcohol or meat consumption. Take a look at figure 9-6, located on page 312 of your textbook. As you can see, the largest source of calories varies by country, with maize, rice, and wheat being the most important. Maize is called corn, both in the United States and Canada. But notice where rice is most abundant, particularly in Asia and parts of South America, where maize is most abundant, which happens to be Mexico and Central America and parts of South America. And wheat is very much prevalent in most of the world as the leading energy source. Can you think of any common dishes that are consumed in different regions of the world that happen to utilize these particular energy sources? Next, take a look at figure 9-7 located on page 313 of your textbook. As you can see, developed countries consume more calories per person on average than many developing countries. To maintain a moderate level of physical activity, according to the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization, an average individual needs to consume on a daily basis at least 1,844 calories. Average consumption worldwide is above that, at 2,902 calories per day. Most people do get enough to survive, but remember, about 10% of the world is living in food insecurity. People in developed countries are also consuming on average nearly twice the recommended minimum, at 3,400 calories per day. The United States has the world's highest consumption, at 3,800 calories per day per person. The consumption of so much food is one reason that obesity is more prevalent than hunger in the United States, as well as in other developed countries. Next, take a look at income spent on food. That can also give you an indication of whether you're looking at a developed region or a less developed region. A greater percentage of income is spent on food in developing countries. So the darker the green you see here, the more of their income they have to spend on basic survival for food. One exception to that, however, is Japan. And Japan imports a lot of its food. That's why there's a higher percentage spent on food. However, it is a very wealthy country with a pretty high GDP per capita. Protein is a nutrient needed for growth and maintenance of the human body. Many food sources provide protein of varying quantity and quality. One of the most fundamental differences between developed and developing regions is the primary source of protein. Take a look at figure 9-11, located on page 314 of your textbook. A greater percentage of protein comes from meat for people in developed countries. In developed countries, the leading source of protein are meat products. This includes beef, pork, and poultry. Poultry is another term that is used to describe chicken or turkey. Meat accounts for approximately 1/3 of all protein intake in developed countries. In contrast, it only accounts for 1/10 in developing countries. In most developing countries, it's cereal grain that provides the largest share of protein. Looking at figure 9-12 on page 315 of your textbook, you can see cereals are the leading source of protein in developing countries. And so taking a look at the key, you can see that in most of the world, aside from the Americas, Western Europe, and Australia and New Zealand, you find protein consumption, whereas the rest of the world, it's cereal. By the way, when we use the term cereal, we're talking about cereal grain, not necessarily the boxes of cereal that you see in the grocery store. Just as a last recap, most food is consumed in the form of cereal grains, especially wheat, rice, and maize. People in developed countries consume more total calories and a higher percentage through animal products. And lastly, most humans consume more than the recommended minimum calories, and the number who are undernourished is declining. But undernourishment is still common in Asia and sub-Saharan Africa. This marks the end of the lesson on Key Issue 1 and Key Issue 2. Stay tuned for lessons on Key Issue 3 and Key Issue 4, which will be done in parts.